Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, July 7th, 2022, and today's question is going to be whether or not the state of Texas is going to be competitive in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, Texas has been the topic of discussion for quite some time now amongst Democratic circles, and the reason for that is because Texas's demographics and shifts seem to suggest that the state itself is going to be competitive for the next couple of decades. Texas had long been a safe red state, voted for Mitt Romney by 16 points, voted for John McCain by double digits, voted for many other Republicans, George W. Bush by 23 points, hadn't gone to a Democrat since Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, and still hasn't. But in more recent years, it has gotten a lot more competitive, and in the most recent presidential election, Texas was decided by single digits and explicitly 5.6%. This is a swing state by the truest definition, a state that is decided by a narrow enough margin that it can be decreed as such. Now, the Republican Party, on the other hand, has a bit of a different take. They think that Texas is a one-off situation, that it isn't a competitive state. But Beto O'Rourke and Democrats in 2020 would argue entirely against that. So for 2022, we are going to be looking at whether or not Texas will actually be competitive given our national environment. Now, again, Texas, in my firm belief, is a swing state. Texas was decided by 5.6%. To put that into perspective, Texas was less red than Minnesota was blue. Minnesota's margin of victory for Biden was higher than Trump's in Texas. Same thing for Democrats in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Virginia, and in New Hampshire. All states that Donald Trump targeted in 2016 and in 2020 that Republicans didn't think would be too hard to win, and yet they struggled more to win Texas than Democrats did in a bunch of these states where Republicans thought they had a fighting chance. My point is, Republicans can't take things for granted because they did so in 2018 and they only won by 3. They did so in 2020 and only won by 6. It's a trajectory that has been established over the past decade and a half, and it's something that honestly I expect to continue. But for the sake of 2022, that is the true question. A bunch of polls have been released in the specific governor's race in the state of Texas. Now, why we have the governor's race in particular is because there is no Senate election in Texas this election year. The last Senate election was in 2020, in which John Cornyn won by less than double digits. Quite surprising for a senator who had expected to win by large double digits in his last election in 2014, won Texas by 27 points. Fast forward to 2020, won by 9.6%. But 2 years prior to that, there was another Senate election in which Ted Cruz won by 2.6%. 2.6% in Texas, in a state where 6 years prior, Ted Cruz won that election by an overwhelming margin of 16 points. Just something to think about when you look at Texas in the near future. But for 2022, we are without a Senate race and instead are more focused on the governor election in the state of Texas. This will be the first true test for Democrats and their ability to win in 2024 in Texas and many years beyond. Now, as I said, we have seen polls from the state of Texas thus far, from CBS News, the University of Texas, Quinnipiac University, all of which telling us that the Republican Party is ahead. Texas actually just had a special election in the 34th district in which a Democratic plus double-digit district from 2020 flipped to the GOP. But then the Dobbs decision released, and we haven't had much polling from the state of Texas, giving us a general idea of what to expect. But with more recent polls from Texas, the consensus has practically been clear. Greg Abbott, the Republican incumbent who won back in 2018, is running for a third term and is likely to win re-election across the state. But some of these polls seem to suggest that that margin is 5 points, 6 points, 8 points. But the FiveThirtyEight forecast holds an entirely different expectation. According to FiveThirtyEight, Greg Abbott has a 96% chance of victory to Beto O'Rourke's 4%. Beto O'Rourke is the famous Democrat from Texas, a former U.S. representative who almost won the Senate election in 2018, the one who lost to Cruz by 2.6%, ran for president in 2020, peaked at third place, dropped out before the primaries, endorsed Joe Biden, and then now is returning to run for governor. But that 4% chance definitely isn't something that the Democratic Party is looking to as a competitive seat. Texas is supposedly in play according to these polls, but in terms of what is expected by political models, you don't exactly see that. Now, FiveThirtyEight gives us the luxury of adjusting based off of polls, fundraising numbers, past voting patterns, and also expert ratings. So right now we're looking at the expectation in Texas simply based off polls. And even that alone, in the state of Texas, what we find is that Abbott is expected to win by somewhere around 9 points. That doesn't scream competitive, but it does say the Democrats are able to keep it under 10, which means it actually will be competitive in 2024. We'll talk about why that is because of our national environment. But the deluxe model shows a lot worse numbers for the Democratic Party in a state that they really want to win in the future. It's a huge state, 40 electoral votes now, and really could change the tides of many, many elections. But the popular vote numbers and expectations from 538 is not only that Greg Abbott is going to win, but he's going to win by 14 points. 14 points in a state that was decided by 5.6% in the last election. Tell me this isn't bad for the Democratic Party. Because it is. Plainly speaking, it is. If you go past to back elections, to go in the past to previous elections, you will find that Abbott was the victor in 2018 by 13.3%. It was a reduction. 2014, he won by 20 points against Wendy Davis. The Democrats thought they might have an opportunity here very clearly. That was rejected and pushed down upon immensely in the state of Texas. You go to 2018, and Lupe Valdez was also pushed down and rejected by voters in the state of Texas, while the Senate election narrowed up by over 10 points more for the GOP. But fast forward to 2022, the fact is 538 expects the Democratic Party to perform worse in this year, despite continuous trends of Texas getting closer. The trend is more easily established and recognizable on the presidential level. This is the start of the 21st century. Texas was decided by 21, then by 23, then by 12, then by 16, then by 9, then by 6, and seems to be getting closer ever since. 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, and then the closest it has been in a long time. The last time it was this close was in 1996. But yet Democrats in Texas don't really have much of a fighting chance, as so it seems, according to 538. So to be given the answer from the political forecast from 538, the answer is no. Texas won't be this competitive state. But what Democrats should look for is not winning Texas in 2022, because that is very much out of the ordinary and out of expectations. In addition to that, Greg Abbott isn't exactly this extremely polarizing or unpopular figure as Ted Cruz is. Now, following the winter crisis and gun laws and abortion laws, Greg Abbott probably shouldn't be this likely to win. But Texas is just Texas. Republicans have clung on to this idea that Texas is inherently Republican, and that will be put to the true test. And I say the Democratic Party should look for a result that is similar to the light model if they want to see some level of a victory in Texas in the near future. And I say that because Greg Abbott won by 13 points in a year so unfavorable for the GOP. In a state where the Texas Democrats won House seats, they did well in the Senate election, yet the governor election, they dropped the ball. Should they drop the ball again? 4 years later, where demographics favor Democrats more heavily, there are more Democratic voters, and the state itself is more conducive to Democrats at least narrowing up the margin. Should Greg Abbott expand off of 2018? I don't think that's something that can just be swept under the rug under this idea that Texas was in a red wave year and all of a sudden it shifted so heavily in favor of the GOP. I don't buy that as an excuse for the Democratic Party when they've had elections such as 2016 and 2020, where down-ballot Republicans and President Trump did better than expected, and yet they were still single-digit races, and this one can't be with the star Democrat Beto O'Rourke in the state of Texas. I mean, this expected 14-point margin of victory would be bad for the Democratic Party, which is why they should look to hope for a margin that is similar to the light one. Because should the Democrats only lose by single digits again when the national environment is so favorable to the GOP, it says that voters here are still narrowing up the race, that there are still more and more Democratic voters moving into Texas, being born in Texas, becoming 18 in Texas, registering to vote, getting out there to vote, despite the Republican Party's consistent remarks that Texas is not a battleground, that Texas is not within reach for the Democratic Party, because it shows that Democrats still did well in an environment where it just simply wasn't for them. But if Greg Abbott wins by more than 13.3%, I will say the Republicans did do better than expected, because the race should be more competitive than that. Knowing what has happened in Texas, knowing who the Democrats have read, and knowing what they are fundraising like, it really makes sense for us to see a margin that is similar to what is expected on the light level, but based off of the complex rating or deluxe rating, that's not what seems to be expected by expert forecasters or expert ratings. The Texas polls do suggest, though, this single-digit victory, and sometimes, actually, surprisingly enough, Texas polls underestimate the Democratic Party. It did not do so in 2020. Joe Biden was expected to do better in Texas than he actually did. But in 2018, the expected margin of victory for Ted Cruz in the state of Texas hovered around high single digits. You're talking polls that showed Cruz ahead by 7, 8, 9 points. There's a reason why national Democrats did not put Texas on their radar when they had states to worry about such as North Dakota, Indiana, West Virginia. They could have put more resources that they allocated in North Dakota and Indiana that they ultimately lost by larger margins than what Cruz's victory was in Texas, and actually flipped Texas. But because it wasn't on the radar, because polls didn't suggest it, nobody was expecting it, and it was one of those sleeper races, well, it ultimately ended up being closer. O'Rourke was underrepresented in these polls, and the results were unexpected because O'Rourke was losing by 7, 8, 9 points and only lost by 3. That might happen this time around, but it doesn't look like that is the expectation, according to FiveThirtyEight or practically any other pollster that is looking at the race. We can take a look at the expert ratings in the state of Texas. Taking a look, we're going to have to use the Wikipedia method where we jump ahead to 2022. Looking at the general election predictions, what we see is that the results here are clear. Only Real Clear Politics has it as a less likely Republican state than anything else. But everywhere else is either likely or solid red. FiveThirtyEight has it at solid. Fox News, no surprise there, but likely Republican. Politico, Sabato's Crystal Ball, the Cook Political Report, likely Republican. Inside Elections, solid Republican. Nobody here expects it to be A, a toss-up, or B, a Democratic victory. And the same can be said for the Senate race in the state of Texas in 2018, but compare the two environments. Very different years. Texas will be competitive, though, in the future if Democrats keep this in single digits. I will say that because I believe that is the test about whether or not the Democrats have walked back their advancements in Texas through their campaigning style, through who they're associated with, through the Republican Party's maneuvering. That's something that I could really imagine being a test about whether or not Democrats have actually lost ground in the state of Texas. But keeping it under single digits, I would say that is a success for the Democratic Party in part. Should the Republican Party do better than they did in 2018, I would say Republicans did damage to the Democratic Party, and it's being shown in this governor election. I mean, Democrats see Greg Abbott as this targetable candidate largely because he has messed up in the state of Texas. He's done things at the wrong time. He's taken positions that are unpopular across some parts of the state, but it is still very likely that he is reelected. And a lot of it he can blame, or the Democrats can blame, on the national environment, sure. Biden is unpopular. Democrats are down on the generic ballot. It's just history. It's also just Texas. It's also a state that Trump won by 6 in a year where the national environment on the national level was Democrats +4. Which again is why, if there's an environment such as this one where Republicans are up by 3 and Democrats keep it within single digits, that it is something that will show that Democrats still have a fighting chance within the state. But there's also the opposite, where if Republicans do better, it does show that something has walked back against the Democratic Party. And it's clear to see, with where we are right now, this race is easily winnable for the GOP. Never once did I expect Greg Abbott to lose this governor election from the very beginning. I've been very consistent in how I've expected Texas to go. It has been this likely, sometimes even a safe red state on my predictions. And I stand by that. It will stay in that range of comparison or range of characterization for the foreseeable future, likely through November. So Texas Democrats probably should be also more focused. Rather than on the governor level, I would say elevate Beto O'Rourke, get that name recognition continued for Beto O'Rourke, in addition to benefiting down ballot Democrats. But I would also say that Texas Democrats could maybe focus on the 1 or 2 House races that are going to be competitive. What the Republican Party did was remove competitiveness from many of these congressional races, made them more solid Republican, more solid Democrat, which means less enthusiasm all around, and less contentiousness within these races, which means people aren't going to be as excited to vote, as willing to turn out to vote. If a race isn't competitive on any level, why would you end up voting? And ultimately, that benefits the GOP because the Republican Party votes in a much higher level than the Democratic Party does, whether it's a midterm election or a presidential election. When turnout is low, the rule of thumb typically is that the Republican Party does better. We've seen in 2020 that it is disproven on the opposite level. The Democrats do better when turnout is high, but I will say that that typically is correct, especially in midterm elections. But when you see an unenthused electorate, you typically see Republicans doing much better. See 2014 or even 2010 for an example. Whereas 2018, it took the Democratic Party driving up turnout across the nation in order to get their vote out there. It wasn't that Democrats went out and Republicans stayed home. It was that Democrats turned out at a higher rate, whereas 2014 and 2010, it was more so the Democrats stayed home. So we'll see what happens in the state of Texas. I think it's definitely going to be interesting. All of these races are really intertwined. If people are inspired to vote in the congressional race, they're of course going to vote in the governor's race because these are down ballot races. They see governor first and they're like, okay, let me get to where I'm going. They're not going to skip over questions. You rarely ever see that happening. And you're talking maybe thousands of residents out of millions of votes. You rarely see it happen. It's not going to happen in the state of Texas. But for right now, we don't know how these governor elections are going to go, but we can be pretty clear on one thing. Texas won't be competitive for 2022, but its results will determine competitiveness for 2024 and years beyond. There are signs to be read following the results. Some good for the Democratic Party, some bad. And we will see what happens. This has been a state Democrats have been eyeing up for decades now, really looking at the demographic shifts, especially more recently, looking to it as a target, and we will find its first true test about electability and capability for the Democratic Party in this November election for many years beyond. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord link for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.